Hi, I'm Mitch, and welcome to the Restoration Road, where my guest today is Tinisha Weigelt. Tinisha is an amazing human being, and God is at work in her life, and I look so forward to what He has next for her. You are going to be inspired by this vibrant human being that God has brought today. Tinisha, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with your love story, because I think it's really, really cool. As a young woman, you had committed to God not to date.
Yes.
And then a year after that commitment, something happens, I think.
So a year after I committed not to date, I was in the Capitol in one of the tunnels underneath Independence Avenue. And type A personality, I was in a hurry to get where I was going. And there was this guy, staffer, who had this large tour group. And you're supposed to keep everyone corralled to one side so everyone else can get by. But they were everywhere. And being a nice Southern girl, I thought, well, I don't want to be rude and like push past. I hadn't, become accustomed to DC life yet. And so I thought they were talking about a chandelier in the Capitol outside the old Supreme Court chambers. And I knew why the chandelier hung there, but he didn't. I thought, if I interrupt, I can get in front of them, tell them why it's there, and then be gone faster than waiting behind them. So I interrupted. I told him why it hung outside the old Supreme Court chamber, and I shook his hand, and apparently we shook too long because he thought I was interested in him. And so he got on the House internet system and found me and emailed me and asked me out for coffee to say thank you. He made it seem very simple, but I was like, number one, I don't drink coffee. Number two, I don't even remember you other than you smiled too much. But I eventually decided, I was like, well, you know what? I'll go out to coffee with him because I had to waste time to meet up with another friend to go to a party that night, a friend that I'd gone to college with. And so we went for coffee. Neither one of us drank coffee. We had hot chocolate. And we talked for about 3 hours. But I was very upfront and kind of standoffish. I was just like, the next person I date, I want to be my husband. I thought, if that doesn't scare him, I don't know what else will. And so, but he became very relentless.
Well, I want to hit the pause button on that. And you have accomplished more in your young life than most people do in several lifetimes. And so I want to pick up, where in the world does that come from, that drive?
My parents laid a really solid foundation in the sense of saying, I was crazy enough to believe them when they said, if you work hard enough and believe you can do it, you can do it. And so I always thought, well, if I want to do this, then I work at it, I figure it out, and I get it done. And, my parents were strong influences in my life, both hard workers and dedicated. They both served early in the Air Force, then got out after having kids. My mom and grandmother, my dad's mom, encouraged my dad to go back to college. She just said, you're not going to be able to find something else. You need to improve yourself for your family. And so mom worked second shift. He worked during the day and went to college at night for a season until he finished, and then was an engineer. And then my mom went on to work at Vanderbilt Medical Center. So they worked really hard, but they also poured into us. They were our coaches. In our sports, they were always there.
That is awesome. And you had a foundation of faith. I don't think you can ever remember not being a Christian.
I was baby Jesus the first year I was born.
Seriously, you really were, right?
And kind of touch on it, my parents moved my dad was originally from Tennessee, and they moved from California in 1977. I'm biracial. White father, black mom. My little white grandmother went to our family church and said, my son's bringing home his black wife and his mixed grandbabies, so let me know now if I need to move my membership. And then I was baby Jesus that year at that church. So still family church, but Sunday service, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And then after I graduated high school and went off to college, I ended up going to a church in Nashville. It was a large church.
5,000 people.
Yes.
Well, what are you like in high school? Like, do you know I'm going to Washington, D.C., I'm going to pursue this kind of career? How does that unfold? Because I assume you're Miss Everything, you're president of the class, you're doing all those things, you're leading everything.
I always knew that I was a strong leader. I wasn't pushy in my leadership style, but again, it goes back to that thing of knowing if I want something, pretty much not much is going to stop me. And so I was pretty determined in that. So I think even friends in high school wouldn't be surprised that I'm doing what I'm doing.
Now, I think discerning a Holy Spirit prompting is a learned skill, but when it's in an audible voice, that's pretty clear. You felt that God called you to Washington, D.C. audibly?
Yes.
How'd that happen?
Oh, I had really been seeking God, probably more in depth than I ever had in my life, because I was at a crossroads. And I knew I wasn't professionally and personally of where I wanted to go. I'd done state government, and I was working at a nonprofit, and I was just trying to cry out to God and say, what's next? Either I'm going to DC or I'm going to LA, and which one is gonna make sense? And first he just said, you're leaving, and by the end of the year, you'll be gone. And I was like, oh, okay. And it's one of those where it's kind of surreal of like, did that just happen? But then everything started lining up. I would get a word from someone else of, oh, you're leaving, right in front of my boss. She's leaving and she's gonna be going to do this. And
were you working with Mercy Ministries at the time?
Yes, I was.
And talk about what you were doing. That's now Mercy Multiplied.
Yes, I was the director of community relations. And so I did fundraising, and then I did kind of our community outreach and worked with our board of directors. And it was one of the best seasons of my life.
What is that ministry?
Sure, they work with troubled girls, from unplanned pregnancies to eating disorders, self-harm, cutting, that type of thing.
And you got to know Dave Ramsey,
yes,
who was on the board.
He was on the board, and our board members from Nelson Mazda to, a lot of the publishing groups, a lot of people in Nashville really poured into that ministry and were very supportive.
So are you done with Middle Tennessee State when you're in this
Yes.
Process with God on Washington, D.C.?
Yes, so I went to Middle Tennessee State University for college. My degree's in international relations. I thought I would go into foreign service eventually, and there's still part of me that wants that. But my last year, I'd interned with the Tennessee General Assembly. And right after I graduated, I started with a lobbying firm. And then I worked for the governor's office in the Department of Transportation as a legislative liaison. So that's...
Did you feel something like a spark inside you as you're working in the legislature and with the governor, like you liked that kind of a thing with government?
I loved it.
Oh,
I
wow.
loved it. I thrived on it. I mean, sitting at our Monday meetings with our commissioner, our department attorney, our other legislative director, and our chief engineer, and we're talking about our roads and our priorities, and we're talking about legislation that's coming up and the impact. I remember our staff attorney at one point was like, "Where did you learn to do this?" And I was just like, "You just learn it, you feel it," and that's kind of how it was for me.
So your process in this Washington, D.C. thing with God, and how does that unfold then?
Sure. So in the midst of that, Rebecca Contreras from Presidential Personnel came to visit the ministry to speak to us. And because I was one of the few natives from Nashville, there aren't that many, I was showing her around town, and she just said, "So when are you going to go to D.C.?" And I was like, she's just being nice, you know. But then we went to D.C. to do the faith-based initiative and went to the White House, and we were with her again in her office, and she said, "Oh, so when are you coming up? When are you going to come work in my office?" In front of my boss, by the way.
Unbelievable.
And my boss at that point, there'd been 2 words of, spoken in front of her. And so we went back, and she said, "If that's where you want to go, I support you." And in the midst of that, Rebecca moved to the Department of Treasury. And so I flew to DC, I interviewed for a job with her. And then if anyone's ever been through presidential personnel, you know that it takes a while for your file to move. In the meantime, my resume had gotten into the hands of Congressman Randy Forbes' staff. And I got a phone call on a Monday or Tuesday, and they're like, "Hey, can you fly in on Friday for an interview?"
Where did he represent?
Southern Virginia,
Okay.
So like Chesapeake up into Richmond.
So he wasn't your personal congressman?
Not my congressman. Okay. I still don't know for sure how they got my resume. But I was like, sure, I'll fly up. I had, I had a free plane ticket on Southwest, hopped on the flight. Who gets on the flight with me? One of my pastors comes on. He had to go to DC too.
Oh, wow.
So he was like, "What are you doing?" But I flew up, I interviewed, and then they offered me the job on Monday.
Wow, and you accepted.
I accepted, and they held the job until I could, I wanted to close out. I feel the way you leave something is the way you enter something. And I wanted to be respectful of my job and closed everything out for the year and then packed everything in my little Ford Focus and drove to D.C.
Did you tell God you needed 3 things to happen?
I did. I told him I needed 3 things. I needed one of my pastors from church to confirm it. I needed to be able to financially line things up. And then I needed my dad to approve. And I thought, of all those, my dad would be the least, he'd be less likely, because to go to D.C.
It would be so hard for me.
It was a demotion. I mean, I was like starting all over again, because I started as a staff assistant, which is, other than intern, that's as low as it is. And I was only a staff assistant for like a month, but.
Imagine that.
But I expected him to say, that the pay isn't great. We don't have an income tax in Tennessee. You're going to have all these taxes. And he just said, Tinisha, staying here is not going to get you to where you're supposed to be.
Wow. God's vision is followed by his provision. And you find a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home rented by missionaries for $435 a month in D.C.
Yes.
Right, or outside?
Just outside of D.C., but yes.
Which is unheard of.
It's in a community that's $1 million homes. So it's not hard to be $1 million home in D.C., but it was unheard of. Less than a mile walk to the metro. I had my own little parking area, so I didn't have to pay to park or worry about parking garages. It was perfect.
You are the classic overachiever, and you actually went to Christian counseling to discover why you're selfish. You just were prompted and just did that on your own?
So before I left Nashville to go to D.C., that same year whenever I was transitioning and everything, I was like, there are things in me that, I probably need to evaluate and sit down with someone, because at that point I didn't really want to be married ever, and I didn't want to have children ever because I was a bit selfish. And there were other things that I wanted to do. And so I just said, okay, why not go now? I can afford it. It's right here. I trust the counselor, and work through those issues kind of in preparation, I think, for later on. I just didn't expect it to be so soon.
So it kind of intertwines with Smiling Matthew and your long handshake and his pursuit. That starts to pick up in a relationship, and I think he's going to introduce you to his parents?
Yes. Before that, he'd been communicating with his mom, getting advice from his mother and sister. And at that point, after the 3rd time I said no, they said, just give up on her. And he said no.
Oh, wow.
So,
that's an interesting subplot.
So I called my best friend in New York. I was like, hey, we're just going to be friends. And 2 weeks later, I call her and say I'm meeting his parents. And she's like, what happened? And I was like, he said no. So he kind of stood up for himself. So his parents fly into D.C. They were coming in anyway. Met them. He worked for Congressman Souter at that point. And as soon as I opened up the door to his office, and she was right there. And when we hugged, it felt like home. And I think she would say the same thing. It was very comfortable. And it's hard to say we had fun. We had fun that weekend, but it was also the weekend when Reagan had passed away. So they got to be there for that. And I also got to see how close-knit of a family they were.
That appealed to you because that's what you had.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, they're a little bit more close-knit in the sense that there were more rooms in that house to sleep in, but they would bring mattresses in and sleep in one room and talk all night. I was like, who are these people?
I've never heard of that.
But they're that close.
That's kind of
because
neat.
In looking at their family story, it was the 4 of them. His father was called in ministry, after I think Matt was 7 when they left Wisconsin for Georgia. And so they had to kind of band together if you're moving from Wisconsin to Georgia and you've never been in the South. So different family, slightly different, but both of us were rooted in faith and strong family units.
The proposal sounds like a movie. Where did he propose?
So he proposed underneath that same chandelier outside the old Supreme Court chamber one night after work.
That's beautiful. That was good work. Did he get that advice from his mom? Or,
I think that was all his own. I was very shocked.
Good. So you get married in Tennessee, and it's just like something you'd see in the movies, right?
We got married. It's a beautiful Italian villa out in the middle of farm country. It's a yellow and white home, and we had a white horse and carriage, and sunset in late July, and the weather cooperated. It was only 75 that day, which is unheard of, and it was just beautiful. And all of his family came in, and all of my family came in. There were like 175 of us, and it was just a great night. And it was great because we had our parents meet before the wedding because we didn't want them to meet for the first time when we were getting married. And so they shocked us because, we knew they were meeting on a Saturday. His parents had to be in Nashville for a church convention. And, I'm like, they should be finished by now. No one's called us. And so 3 hours later, my mom finally calls and she's like, oh, it was wonderful. We could have sat all day. And our parents got along really well. I mean, I always laugh and say it was kind of like Meet the Fockers because my parents his parents, the way they grew up in their faith, a lot of times, like, they couldn't watch movies and they rediscovered stuff a little bit later on. But my family was not that strict. And, but yeah, everyone meshed really well.
I want you to talk about your mom and then lead up to 2009.
So my mom and I, my dad always said, oh, you guys are just alike. Oh, no, we're not. We were. Very strong-willed, determined. My mom always told me, look, you don't have to get married, but if you do, have a career first. So you can be a little selfish, so you can have some of your own accomplishments. I understood that after I had kids, what she meant.
Yeah.
And it was important to me because she knew what my personality was like. We'd speak on the phone every day, but we had a rule. 3 to 5 days in the same house was more than enough. You can only take, us in doses. And everyone knew that around us, so we had fun with it. Yeah, my kids, she loved her grandkids. I mean, we said she lost her mind when she had grandkids. Whenever we told them we were having our first child, we were like 3 weeks pregnant. I'm like, this is just early. The next week, gifts were arriving for our unborn child. I'm like, Mom, he can't wear, we don't know if it's a boy, you just sent Air Jordans. Well, she can wear them too. So they had fun. His mom was the same way. She was a strong influence in my life. My father as well, I was a daddy's girl, which probably drove my mom crazy. But, they would do anything for us. And then in 2009, we got word that my mom was diagnosed with cancer, which was really hard. It was hard because we laugh in my family. My brother and sister and dad are like ostriches when it comes to bad news. They bury their head in the sand until they have to come out. And my personality is charge in, figure it out, and get the facts. And I'll never forget when her surgeon came out and said, I think it might be stage 2. Not sure if it's, cancer or not, but all they heard was that it wasn't cancer. You didn't hear what she just said. And so she had ovarian cancer. She went through treatments. We spent a lot of time going back and forth to Tennessee because thankfully with my job with the congressional office, I could telework. And so I'd take my computer with me and I'd go work from wherever. We'd go to Gatlinburg. Every family vacation you could think of, we were doing everything. But then in October of 2011, she called each of us individually, me, my brother and sister, and said basically that they tried everything. There was one more thing they could keep trying, but it wasn't good and it'd be really hard for her to continue with it. And all 3 of us separately had said, we'd rather have you for a shorter period of time than for you to be in pain for the rest of this time. And so she stopped chemo, and my boss called me after he found out, and he said, go home and do whatever you got to do.
That's amazing. And
what's even more amazing, at that point, Isaac was, my youngest, was 2.5, which meant James Lawrence is probably 5, I think. And my husband and mother-in-law said, just leave. We'll take over here. You just go take care of home. And so I drove to Tennessee, and I stayed was my mom's primary caretaker from then until she passed in December. My brother and sister had done everything with my dad until then, and they still continued to help. But I realized once I got home, they needed a break.
Yeah.
It had been really hard, and it was hard.
Did she request a family portrait?
We did do a family portrait, all of us. We're out in a country field, and it was just having all of us there together. And we all get along, too. I mean, it's awesome. Good that that's the case, but yeah.
When you heard the diagnosis, you were angry with God. I think that's normal. How did you process that?
I was angry, but still hopeful. I think at that point it was still, clinging to the promises of what's in the Word. but not understanding why things happen. I think the hardest resolve was after. Because what is it, Deuteronomy that says, seek me with all your heart and I'll be found by you. And that's when, like, that season I went through before DC, I look back at now and I'm like, oh, I feel like looking back now, that was God preparing me, not for then, but for when my mom passed, for now. And understanding that he's always there. I'm the one that's turned or stepped back. And it was okay to be angry, that he wasn't upset, like he knew I was angry. It's not like I can lie and pretend to God. And working through those emotions, that it was okay to work through those emotions. Because I think sometimes in our faith, it's champion and rise above everything. Well, that's easier said than done when you're the one in the pain, because I'd never encountered anything that painful in my life. It's still hard, and it's been this many years. It makes Christmas hard, because that was what she loved. But she would kill us if we didn't celebrate with all our might, because of, one, our faith, but two, because of how much she loved to give at that season. And she was always giving. We didn't know how much she gave until later. I mean, even when we were in school, there were kids, we couldn't understand why she wouldn't let us ride to school with her. We later found out that there was a kid who his parents didn't have money for like toiletries. So she would meet him at school early, bring supplies for him, even clothes sometimes, so he could shower and change before school.
That is incredible.
And she didn't want us to know, so that, so there was so he felt secure.
Sure.
So there were a number of things like that.
Well, she also, before she went to heaven, requested a swing set be built in the front yard.
Yes, that was one of her big anniversary presents. So she could sit and watch her grandkids play. Like, some of us would want a diamond or a trip. She wanted a play set, a wooden one, a big, large one. And then sister-in-law got a swing thing so she could sit on the porch and watch them play. And so the week before she passed, that was one of the last things she did. She was out there in her hoodie and coat, bundled up, and watching her grandkids. And so we had a lot of special moments in time during all of that. I mean, the movie 2 Weeks, there's a scene where they're chewing their food and spitting it out because she can't eat. So we did that. We understood why, because we made bacon and she wanted bacon too. So.
And when she passed, you had to engage with your dad in a new way. Can you describe how you did that? That
was hard. My dad went through, and understandably so. I mean, they were married for 34 years, and it was like seeing him lose all sense of everything. I took care of all of his finances for him, and he was dialed in. My brother and sister knew what was going on, but he couldn't really pull himself together for a while. And so we all kind of rallied around him. I mean, I was like, send him to me. So he came and stayed with us for a week or so, but he was like, it's too cold up here. But kind of mutually keeping an eye on and making sure that he was okay. And then about 6 months in, we started to see a shift, and he was starting to get better, but it was hard. It was a lonely season.
Well, I'm sure he was thankful to have you.
Yeah.
And that was just precious, what you did for him and how you engaged with him. Describe what you do for Congressman Banks.
Sure. So now I'm a district director. So I manage our entire operation here in the 3rd Congressional District. We have outreach staff, and so we develop an outreach and strategy plan for our outreach team, our coalitions. We have casework division that deals with interactions with federal agencies. So if someone has a problem, or they're trying to get their veterans benefits, or they've been approved for Social Security disability, but they haven't started paying them yet. So we interface with the government on their behalf to get an answer faster, hopefully. Now, we don't think we should have to do, that's not something we wish had to happen, but the fact is that we need someone there to be that bridge.
Due to the bureaucracy, we need an advocate.
Yes.
You are amazing. When Richard Nixon was president and my dad was the youngest state senator in the country, he actually won before he was old enough to serve. He won the election before he was old enough to serve. He had a dinner with Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon looked at him and he said, I wish I had your future instead of my past. And Tinisha, when I'm with you, that's what I think exactly. Your future is unbelievable. I think God is going to use you in mighty ways. How do you exercise your faith in a government role?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is in being authentic. It's relationships.
Yes.
I think I learned early on in my faith walk is that sincerity means more about showing up and being true to who you are as a person, and people gravitate toward that more than, let me tell you. Now, there's a time when you tell someone about, like, let me tell you about the word, but it's more about someone understanding your life and lifestyle and being drawn to that and that relationship versus kind of the in your face. Again, there's a season for that. I have a great friend who, in high school, he told a girl she was a Philistine heathen and she was going to burn in hell. She smacked him. And then 2 months later, she told him, that was one of the reasons why she got right with God.
Oh, my goodness.
But that was not necessarily the way God gave to me.
Right.
To pursue that. But I think a lot of it is in those relationships, being authentic with people and really caring about people. It's in the political world, it is very easy to be superficial and use someone for something.
Yes.
That happens all the time. But it's more important to build a relationship, and we're not even the same party, but we both have a responsibility and a vision to get something accomplished. And so you build a friendship and a relationship in that sets that apart from that political gain. And I think people see through that a lot more now than before, too.
Tinisha Weigelt, I cannot wait to vote for you. Thank you so much for being with us today. You're an amazing person.
Thank you.
When I encounter Tinisha, I can't help but think of Colossians 3:23. Whatever you work at, do it with all your heart. Not some of it, but with all your heart, as if you're doing it for God and not merely for men. So I'd encourage you, wherever you are today, work at it with all your heart, as if you're doing it for God. And He will bless you where you are. He will lead you to what's next. He will guide you, and you will find that His vision is indeed followed by His provision.